So this is kind of a trick question because there is never one right God. I think there are just bigger and bigger and bigger conceptions of God that we come to in a life. So a better question is, has the God that you are praying to become big enough for all of you? And the reason I ask this is because you're not here to contort to one truth. You are the truth. Over the last 18 months, from January 2025 to the end of June, this Sunday, 2026, astrologically, each and every person has returned to prayer. And in the process, realized that our conception of God was actually limiting us. And that was limiting our desire to pray. Now, over these last 18 months, with some brave adjustments, we have had the opportunity to break free from a limited perspective of what God is or what the truth is, and to really see how big and limitless reality is. In so doing, we saw prayer in everything that we do. So to me, prayer is simply the repetition of devotional action. And thus, prayer is not a strictly spiritual ritual. Prayer is all of the things that we repeat over and over and over again. And that's because it means something to us to do that, whether consciously or unconsciously. In repetition, we merge with the process itself, even though most of the time we think we are doing a process in order to reach an outcome. This return to prayer astrologically is reflected in the transit of the Lunar South Node through the sign of Virgo. The Lunar South Node, and wherever it goes in the zodiac, reflects where there is something deep in our past, deep within us that wants to be brought out. It wants to be surfaced into the present because something is there for us to work with, to share, to relive. In the case of Virgo, we are returning to these behaviors, these prayers. And these are habits that we haven't fully merged with just yet. And we need to. So you can think about the goal of any ritual like this. We want to become a living altar to the God that ritual is meant to put us in communication with. It's like japa beads. Once you've done, I don't know, a certain amount of like hundreds of repetitions, only then do you get to wear it and is it charged. Your life is the same thing. You charge yourself with your identity through the rituals that you enact. So over the last 18 months, the North Node has been in the sign of Pisces, which is the opposite place to that South Node in Virgo. And the North Node in Pisces is that God that we are praying to. And this is a God that wanted us to get bigger, to expand our sense of self that would include the parts of self that were betrayed, abandoned, and not given love. This was a bigger conception of God, a bigger conception of the truth. And that God wants each and every one of us to use our unique discernment to honestly, like artisanally create something that only we can create with our two hands, and to be specific about what we already know and devote ourselves to that process. So that infinite God above us with the North Node in Pisces and the return to personal devotion, that's the South Node in Virgo. So my question for you is, what process have you returned to over the last 18 months since around January 11th of 2025? And how did it expand your conception of God or the truth or what forgiveness is? How did returning to this process connect you deeper to unconditional love? And probably the easiest way to answer this is, where has it been the most difficult to return to this process? And how did your conception of what the truth really is have to change when you confronted the past that you knew you still needed to integrate, right? The Virgo South Node process is of course, daily habits, and it is also an editing process. It is a process of preparation where you need to use your mental analysis or your hand analysis. Enormously dexterous. So, what practical, physical, ritual, creative, decisive, discerning practices did you return to on the daily over the last 18 months? And where did you struggle in that process? And then where do you find yourself on the other side now that this transit is basically over? This is the major question to sit with this week. This is the topic to reflect on these occurrences in your life and to applaud yourself for really reaching the end of it. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to share two things. First is my own personal experience with the South Node in Virgo transit in particular, and then I'll go into some thoughts on the week ahead. Feel free to check the chapters below if you'd rather skip to what's just going on next week. If you're new to my channel, I am an artist, I'm a painter. So the Virgo process of return for me has been about just that. It's been about painting. But my painting process, like many other people's, is complex. There's many things that go into it. And what I've contended with over these last 18 months is how I trust in my own intuitive discernment when it comes to my painting process, how I conceptualize and think about and write about my painting process, because that's always been the bedrock, the cornerstone of why I'm painting. I get so much information from my creative process, so much philosophical perspective, and so much emotional connection to the world around me, to spiritual connection to the world around me. And that process, painting, reflecting, and sharing and teaching on my creative awareness, that feels like my life's purpose. So I consider myself a painter with a strong vision and with a cosmology of what painting is. And so one of the greatest times in my life was actually a few-year period where I was facilitating groups of painters and talking about the metaphysics of painting. As I mentioned, the Virgo Pisces nodes moved into Virgo Pisces early 2025. For most of the year before, in 2024, I found myself really burnt out and actually really wrecked by a few years of misdirected devotion in the context of doing this work that I loved. The perception of God that I had, the reason I was going through the motions of creating art, writing about it, philosophizing about it, sharing it, and leading it in creative groups, the reason I was doing that grew more and more constricted and more limited. And even though that concept to me was fused with unconditional love, I realized I was being limited, I was being fractured, I was being unnecessarily crystallized in a way that was so painful. And I realized in that time this was just me limiting myself and giving my power away to something that wasn't big enough to hold me, which included a self-concept that also wasn't big enough to hold me and the process that I wanted to go through. So because of that limited view of God that had burnt me out, that I perceived as abandoned me, I stopped praying, if you will, okay? And that means, like, I'm not an actual, when I say pray and all of this, I don't mean you have to be folding your hands and closing your eyes and kneeling down. Prayer, again, is that act of devotion that you do daily that you know is going to connect you to your God. When I say I stopped praying in that time, that means I stopped painting. I stopped my teaching programs. I stopped working with the groups that I did because everything seemed to collapse. And in the time that that was happening and afterwards, I really tried to run from it and bury my head in other things. And I was very embarrassed and nothing else was working out, even though I was sincerely trying to devote myself into what was right beyond that process that I was so hurt by. It's taken me really these entire 18 months up until like a few days ago to come to a point of peace with these last few years of my life where I was so fraught in my creative process and how I was sharing my creative perspective and how I was wanting to grow in community with that perspective. And so I've been able to return to a painting process that's on my own terms now. And the thing is, I'm excited to just keep trying again and again and again, as long as it takes, not to reach a goal, but as long as it takes for me to realize that that's who I am, right? And that idea of continued experimentation is really what brings me to the astrology of this week. This is the last week of these lunar nodes being in Virgo and Pisces. This is the last week of our collective expansion into that limitlessness of Pisces, into the truth, infinite truth of God. After this week, the North Node enters Aquarius and joins Pluto by sign. That co-presence of both the North Node and Pluto in the terms of evolutionary astrology means that everything we do is going to be routed through the Aquarian, which is evolution and experimentation and continued pursuit of the horizon that is ultimately unreachable. So this is, in the way I'm thinking about it, the last week where we are praying into infinity, to relax, to rest, and to dream, and to be in limitless possibility, and to really trust how big we are supposed to be in this process. Because what happens after is we have to begin hypothesizing, we have to begin putting things to test. Now, that's all great, right? Everything I've just said about the nodes. But if you've been tuned into any astrology at all recently, you've heard of the basket. And yeah, the truth is, this week has major alignments that cannot be understated. We were not going to ever get astrology like this in our lifetimes. And I know that actually could be said about every astrological day ever, because you never get the same day twice, right? But the astrology that's going on right now is kind of like us each stepping into a Transformers suit that we're not going to be getting rid of anytime soon after, right? We're only going to be building out this suit, building out our relationship to technology, and things this week are really clicking into place. Starting on Monday, we have the Jupiter-Pluto opposition that goes exact. Now, the way that I'm going to run through these next few days is not necessarily beginner-friendly, astrologically speaking, but just let it wash over you if you are a beginner, and allow your own mental curiosities to bring you down different Google rabbit holes into other people's astrological videos, okay? Because I'm more interested in my advice for you and for me this week is to really sit in the end of this nodal transit rather than to make perfect sense of the complex mechanics of the astrology that's going on, okay? So even if it's going over your head, let it wash over you and pick up what makes sense to you, okay? So we have this Jupiter-Pluto opposition that goes exact on Monday. And this is an opposition, the word I'm using is it graduates us into the big leagues. It's not just that the opposition happens once and then we're done. No, this is an entry point into us taking our creative wisdom so seriously and like really growing confidence in ourselves. Not even growing, I'm sorry, it's grown. We have to present the confidence now, right? To the world that is changing so much right now. So on the same day on Monday, the same Jupiter that's opposing Pluto will exact its trine to Neptune in Aries. Okay? This trine is an opportunity for us to create more and more wisdom from the very deep truth of who we know ourselves to be above all of it. Okay? And this is the type of wisdom with Jupiter, the creative wisdom that actually has cultural support. So this isn't really us just going at it alone anymore. Jupiter is about the cultural context that we are in. Jupiter in Leo is about us being able to share our creative wisdom, and with Pluto being right there is likely an audience for you, okay? This isn't a time to just be dear diarying, okay? This is a time to be on stage, to be watching someone on stage, to be doing both. I mean, this week. On Tuesday, the moon will be waxing, it'll be growing, it'll reach the sign of Libra and make its first quarter square to the sun in Cancer. That's a 90-degree aspect. So that first quarter square is always a decision point. We have to bring something internal external, there's some fear, there's some frustration, or there is some pressure to do so, to bring that out of you. And it can be a little scary. But this is a decision that we need to make about, in particular, an emotionally very safe relationship, which is the moon in Libra. It's emotionally safe in the context of the sun in Cancer, right? The sun, this is still the end of Cancer season early this week. And so this first quarter square, this emotional decision, the relationship, the emotionally safe relationship is actually helping us to grow into these experimental processes that I've just talked about by the end of this week, okay? And that's because this first quarter moon in a week, next week, will actually grow into the full moon in Aquarius. So whatever relationship decision we're making on Tuesday of this week grows into a community, like a larger community reflection, a larger community chapter beginning, chapter ending with the moon in Aquarius, where we're really kicking off these next 18 months of experimentation. And that's aided by a one-on-one close relationship this week. This is also in the context of the Venus in Virgo making a square to Mars in Gemini. That's because the Venus in Virgo is ruling the moon in Libra at the time of this first quarter square. And these types of squares, these first quarter squares, which is Venus is making a first quarter square to Mars, the moon is making a first quarter square to the sun. These are squares we can't ignore. These are energies where we really have to externalize things for the first time. And with Venus in Virgo, there are details we need to be confident enough to express to someone that we are in a close relationship with. And those details, in particular, Venus in Virgo is ruled by Mercury, which is still retrograde in Cancer, but will go direct later this week. But at this time, Mercury is still retrograde. And so the details are really still the thoughts that we are churning about how we emotionally process and how we advocate, how we self-advocate for our own emotional truth. Okay? On Wednesday, the sun enters Leo, and this is a huge vibe shift because we're entering a season of personal fire after completing this big season of emotions, big season of feeling. And what this also does is it shifts the rulership schemes. The sun in Leo now rules Jupiter in Leo, and that's it. Whereas before Wednesday, Jupiter in Leo is ruled by the sun in Cancer. So all of the creative expansion, Jupiter in Leo, was still kind of being run through an emotional expression. But once the sun moves into Leo, we are really being much brighter. And that's truly the big shift that we'll feel on Wednesday. And then very quickly, right into Thursday, Mercury's going direct, and we're finally feeling straightened out in some of the work we've done to align our emotional process in a way that feels more authentic, in a way that we can self-advocate with that square to Saturn, right? The same day, the Neptune-Pluto sextile goes exact, and this is a transformer moment where we are locking into our studies of personal truth, right? Neptune in Aries, how our personal truth is allowing for our sense of self to change and allowing for the necessary changes in what humanity is for, okay? And it's also on the same day that the moon will hit that first quarter trine while it's in Sagittarius to the sun in Leo. So this day, Thursday, is really big, is a big opportunity for us to really, like, the heart is open. We've got most of our transformer suit on and it's ready to go. Like, Thursday's a really good day to start something that you've been waiting for, waiting to return to perhaps. Friday and Saturday, there aren't really any major alignments happening, but it is that Sunday that the lunar nodes finally switch. This is the true node, by the way. I always calculate the true node. There is a mean node that some astrologers use, and that switch happens later on next month, but I use the true nodes, and they are switching this Sunday. So that is what I wanted to share this week. Let me know how you're getting on with it. Now, I have a few options to work with me over the next few weeks if you want to delve deeper into my perspective and the way that I read charts. The first is a really sweet little webinar that I'm offering with my colleague Jen of Full Cup Astrology. That'll be next Tuesday, not this Tuesday, but Tuesday the 28th, is it, at 7 p.m. And in that workshop, in that webinar, we will be looking at the Saturn-Neptune phase of our personal charts and reflecting on how it is that we are building out our dream in this life personally. And this is especially important in the context of the recent Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and especially important in this transformer times where we are deeper and deeper locking into the truth and the purpose that we know we are here to manifest. Okay? So I also have full readings available. You can check out my availability on my Calendly. And I'm also promoting half off those readings, which is a pretty big deal. If you join my Substack membership for just $5 a month, that math doesn't really work out, but I'm really wanting to grow my Substack. So if you join on my Substack, which is just $5 a month, then I can give you half off of a full reading. On Substack, we'll be doing more group calls, and you get even more of my writing that I do so much of to sift through, and yeah, more live calls and more interaction, especially catered towards artists and creators and people whose identity is in their own creative process. Like their creative process is a big part of the offering that they're giving the world right now. And so astrology isn't necessarily about astrology. We use astrology in service of the authentic creative process and the metaphysics of it, if you will. So it also just supports me, and I would deeply appreciate that. So hope you have a lovely week ahead, and until next week, goodbye for now.